Have you ever sat quietly in a room and wondered, why am I alone? You did everything you could, but still, the people around you faded one by one. The notifications went silent, and that chair at the table finally stayed empty. What if this silence is opening a new space for you? Loneliness tests everyone, but it forced Jonah to make a choice in a single night, either collapse from the inside or stand back up again. That night, the river overflowed. The community hall turned into a shelter, and Jonah saw a trembling young man and sat beside him, without looking away, without rushing, with one sentence. So, what did he say? You'll understand as you hear this story. Silence either breaks you or rebuilds you. Jonah lived in a small riverside town where mornings were usually foggy. He was in his mid-30s then. He walked slowly, weighed his words, and took a short breath before finishing most sentences. Even the sounds inside a home softened around him. People chose to speak more carefully when he was near. He worked as a caretaker in the town's old community hall. He repaired broken chairs, swept empty rooms, and collected forgotten cups one by one after events. It was a plain building, and his pay was low. But Jonah believed this: God was hidden in small details no one noticed, and in the quiet of patience. One day, he would see the return of that silence. But the town didn't know it yet, and Jonah acted as if he didn't know either. Still, every morning when he opened the door, he thought the same thing. Let me be useful today, he would say. Their lives used to be lively. Rachel, his wife, had laughter that echoed through the rooms. When she laughed, her eyes would narrow and she would warm the whole house. Evenings were busy and full of life. Dinner conversations would stretch long and they would pray together, short, everyday prayers, sometimes nothing but gratitude. Sometimes when rain began, Rachel would crack the window and say to herself, "Smell it," and the scent of wet earth would fill the home. Leah, only about 7 years old, would crouch under the table then, making up stories to herself. As Jonah watched them, he thought life wasn't completed in big moments, but in small ones. The sound of boiling tea, a plate clinking against a fork, footsteps at the door. He wasn't sure if he understood the value of those days enough, but the only thing he knew was this: every time he came home, there was a feeling inside him that everything is okay. Sometimes he looked at Rachel and thought, what did I do to deserve this? Then one autumn morning, illness slipped quietly between them, and Rachel's endless energy gave way, first to a quiet fatigue. She began climbing the stairs more heavily. Her breath started cutting off in the middle of long sentences. She paused. Her smile was still there, but her strength was draining away. Long, sleepless nights, mornings that began earlier, medication schedules, and those never-ending roads to the doctor. When Rachel couldn't sleep at night, Jonah would go down to the kitchen, heat water, and place the cup into her hands. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. They simply shared the same silence and understood each other with a look that replaced prayer. Jonah tried to look strong every moment, but when the door closed behind him, his knees would loosen. Some nights he asked for healing, and some nights only for closeness. "Stay with us," he would say. "That is enough." And one morning, when Rachel quietly said goodbye, in that moment, the house began to feel foreign. A silence fell. Such a silence, such an emptiness, like even the walls stood there, not knowing what to do. Jonah stopped one day and whispered, "My God," he said, "why does love hurt this much?" With Rachel gone, Jonah's world was wrapped in a heavy silence. Not only his steps, but even the passing hours had slowed. A year passed in the middle of that emptiness, And in the end, Leah, now in her early 20s, left for the city to go and build her own life. At the threshold, she promised, "I'll call you often, Dad," she said. At first, the phone rang every day. Then it rang less, and the conversations grew shorter. Sometimes Jonah reached for the phone to call Leah, but he would pause and slowly set it back down, saying, "She must be busy now." One evening, he took paper and pen and wrote only, "I'm fine." He folded the paper and put it in a drawer, but he couldn't send it, because there was one sentence he really wanted to say. "I miss you so much." But he was afraid to write it. He didn't want to place his loneliness on his daughter's shoulders like a burden. He wished for only one thing, to still be useful. So he planted small habits. He started going to the community hall early. Sometimes there would be weddings in the evening. Music would drift from far away, and Jonah would look in for a moment through the crack of the door. The bride and groom's laughter would remind him of Rachel. Children would run, their footsteps filling the corridor. Even when Jonah said, "Be careful," he smiled. Then the crowd would scatter, the lights would go out, and only the sound of his broom would remain. Even if no one noticed, he swept the front step, fixed a broken hinge without anyone feeling it. He listened patiently to those with even small troubles, sometimes without saying a single word, just by standing beside them. What he did was only planting seeds, small seeds left quietly every day with no applause. People asked him, "After life has taken so much from you, why do you still try this hard?" And Jonah said, "Silence is not the absence of God." One winter evening, the river overflowed. Homes were flooded. The power went out. The roads sank into pitch-black darkness. The community hall became a shelter, cold breaths everywhere, and the sleepy crying of children. Jonah came without waiting for anyone to call. He opened the doors, carried blankets, filled thermoses, and managed to calm trembling voices. While people panicked, he was peaceful, as if those years spent in silence had been a rehearsal for today. Late at night, Jonah saw a young man trembling in a corner. Without lifting his head, the young man said, "I lost everyone." He stayed silent for a moment, then added, "I think God forgot me," as if speaking to himself. Jonah walked closer and said, "Son, sometimes God silences everything because he wants to teach you how to listen." Those words surprised even Jonah, like something buried in the ground long ago had suddenly sprouted on its own. A few days later, Jonah, older now, worn down by years of quiet, collapsed at home. Fatigue, illness, and the loneliness of years, all of it fell on him at once. He didn't even have the strength left to tell himself, "I have to be strong." When the town heard, people began to come, unexpectedly. Neighbors he barely spoke to, volunteers he had helped quietly, and strangers who didn't know him but had heard of his goodness. They brought food, stayed by his side, and prayed silently in that small room. They were there with him. In that moment, Jonah understood. No seed had been lost. God had kept them all, and when the time came, returned each one to him like a forest. When Leah heard, she ran back from the city. She cried as she stepped through the door and said, "I left you alone." Jonah smiled weakly. "I was never alone," he said. "I was preparing for this kind of love." Leah wanted to take him to live with her. Jonah stayed silent for a long time. He looked out the window at the river he loved so much and prayed deeply. When he heard that inner voice of "okay," peace filled him. The sign he had waited for years, had arrived. He held Leah's hand and said yes. One day Leah took him to a center that helped people who were grieving.
"Would you join us?" they asked. His answer had no hesitation. Jonah only listened. He sat quietly with people, without trying to fix their pain, just staying beside them. They only felt his presence. He didn't give advice to those who walked in crying. He offered a tissue, brought water, and accompanied their silence. And Jonah finally realized this. God hadn't trained him in that silence only to soothe his own pain, but to become a shelter for the wounds of others. Years passed. Jonah slowed down, but his spirit was stronger than ever. When the time came to say goodbye, that small room was filled with grief, and filled to the brim with people who leaned on his silence. In that moment, Leah understood. Her father's long, lonely years were not an emptiness. They were a patient preparation to build that immense heart that would become a shelter for a whole town's pain.
Here is the truth. When God allows loneliness, He is not punishing you. He is preparing you. He takes away the noise so you can hear love clearly. If you feel alone today, don't rush to fill that silence. A steady habit, a quiet kindness, or an honest prayer. Because the strongest seeds grow only in the soil of silence. Maybe your phone isn't ringing today, and only the ticking of the clock echoes in your room. Take a small step. Open your window. Ask someone how they're doing. That step taken from inside the silence opens the door to tomorrow. And your heart, without even noticing, begins to breathe again, slowly and peacefully. What do you think about the fruit of Jonah's patience and silence? Let's meet in the comments. See you again in the next story.